Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last session of the afternoon. It's going to be informal, and I hope that we will all be able to participate as much as possible. But we're going to have our participation triggered by in a sort of quasi-Parkinson, pseudo-Parkinson attempt on my part. I'd forgotten his name until about a minute ago. To try to talk about three people who I think are people of the sea, who have sea experiences that are inimitable in a variety of ways. And since we're going to be unpacking their lives, I'm not going to do big intros. I'll simply say that, simply give you a one-word description of why they have, or how, at least to my knowledge, they have a connection with the sea. John is pretty difficult because he has about 7 connections with the sea. He is a very enthusiastic and capable diver and amateur archaeologist. He is a museum person with his own museum. He has a number of boats that ply a trade for him in the Solomons, and he is a philanthropist, particularly in the Pacific, with a foundation called Silent World, and there are other things, but we'll get on to those. Mike Blewett is a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and has made films of all kinds, but many, many films, documentary films associated with the sea, and particularly more recently for me, we've worked together to make 3 documentary films on the Great Barrier Reef, and it was a fantastic experience. So, you know, I've had to capture Mike and drag him down from Cairns, because he's a reef man, and to get him to talk about that. And then at the end, we've got Nigel Erskine, who is a curator of the sea. He's done a great exhibition this year on the India-New South Wales trade, or India-Australia, early India-Australia trade, but many other exhibitions. He's a museum director and curator with all sorts of sea experience and island experience, but he's also an archaeologist, maritime and marine archaeologist. So we have a kind of variations of the sea pictures, of sea mood pictures of different kinds. So I'm going to start with, and I hope that they will have a conversation between them. If you want to ask questions while we're talking, put up your hand and we'll integrate them into the discussion, because it's going to be very informal, and you know, we're not going to kind of stand on ceremony at all. So John, I'm going to ask each of you in turn. This first simple question is your earliest engagement with the sea. I mean, how did you, in your early life, if it come to be connected with the sea, which I presume you must have done? I'll ask the same of Mike, and I'll ask the same of Nigel. But can we begin with you, John?
Yes, certainly can. Probably a dual track first experience with the sea. So physically, my parents moved to south of Portugal when I was very young, and I grew up spending hours and hours skin diving, and fishing, and just living off the sea. I had my first little boat when I was just 10 years old. So I sort of grew up with the sea from that perspective. But also, at the same time, I don't know why, but from a very early age, I started to have an interest in exploration of the sea, and particularly the Pacific, because it was the last sort of tapped, unknown frontier until relatively recently in history. Australia in this part of the world wasn't really understood, mapped, or charted. So I was just fascinated by that. All the early explorers, seaborne maritime explorers, through to sort of the modern day. So I guess they sort of grew up on it. The sea's
Was
been
that
part
a
of my
Portuguese
life.
thing? That
No, strangely enough, not. Although I obviously followed all the
yeah.
early Portuguese chronicles and the development of Portuguese interests in the Far East. But it wasn't so specific when I was young. I mean, you know, I was only I was reading books with four-letter words in and stuff. But as I got older, that then morphed into a more specific focus of the early maritime exploration of the Pacific, and particularly Australia, and all of the successive waves of exploration from before recorded history through all the Portuguese, the Dutch, and then the British, French, Spanish, and all the others. And that's now, I guess, an obsession.
Passion.
Probably.
It's a passion. And it's produced a wonderful, wonderful museum. It really has, pound for pound, some of the best stuff I've ever seen.
Well, yeah, that morphed, of course. I got a little bit older, and every time I had a spare dollar, and often when I didn't, I would buy something that went into that collection. So I lived permanently in debt and under the wrath of my wife. But yeah, 30 years later, you look back at all the things we've got, and it's amazing how it grows.
Okay, and what about you, Michael?
Well, I guess the first encounter with the sea is when I was born, really.
Yeah.
All of my family are from Cork in Ireland, and they're all fishermen. They're all boat wrights. They all earn a living from the sea and always have done, and not one of them can swim. And they still go out into the Atlantic every single day and do their fishing.
Is that why you and your brother have both ended up on the reef?
That's why my brother and I both chose very safe occupations on land. It's neither good for your life expectancy or your liver to be a fisherman, from what I consider. And it's always been there, I guess. Always been there. And it's been very interesting because I've been in Australia for 8 years now. And one of the things I did notice is that amongst most people, there isn't a sense of Australia's maritime history or how pivotal the sea has been in the evolution and the growth of this country. And once you start to explore it, largely through my friendship with you, you discover some of the most extraordinary stories. And as a television producer, I mean, I'm always drawn to what is a good story, what is a good dramatic story, and you find them so often in the sea. And I must say, you know, over the last year since we've been doing this work on the Barrier Reef, I'm not sure I've ever come across such extraordinary stories. And take the Peltier story, for example. I mean, is everyone familiar with the story of Narcisse Peltier? I will tell it because I never tire of telling it because it is quite extraordinary. Ian, you pitch it because you told the story. Well, in 1858, a French merchantman was struck a reef near Rossel Island, I believe, and all of the crew, the French crew, plus 300 Chinese labourers, make it to shore. The French crew abandoned the Chinese labourers and set off in a boat and eventually alight at Lockhart, where Lockhart River is now. Amongst the French crew is a 14-year-old cabin boy called Narcisse Peltier. Narcisse falls asleep. He wakes up the next day and the French crew have disappeared. So this 14-year-old boy is absolutely on his own in one of the remotest parts of the world. He is adopted by a local indigenous group and he lives with them for 17 years. And he utterly becomes part of this clan. And he's scarified, his ears are pierced, he possibly married, he possibly had children. And then eventually he's collecting water, rescued / kidnapped by a pearl lugging crew who take him back to France via Sydney, take him back to France. His mother and his brother are waiting on the dockside, and this creature who is dark, scarified, got the he doesn't speak French anymore, appears, and the first thing they do is drag him off to church to be exorcised. But eventually Narcisse tells his story to a local doctor, and I would say it's one of the most detailed accounts of indigenous life pre-European contact we have. It's an extraordinary story. So we did this little sea story as a little 15-minute film, but we're hopefully going to take it a little further, and who knows.
And Mike, there are so many of those stories. That's a particularly incredible one. But
it is
the Charles Eaton and William Ireland and young Doyley, equal story. Barbara Thompson over there.
E.T.
You could spend.
I agree.
Wonderful story. Wonderful story.
Yeah, they're neglected stories. I mean, you know, you wouldn't know this as an archaeologist of the sea. I mean, a great problem is that we don't seem to put the same emphasis on our sea stories as we do on our land stories, and it's very odd because we live all clustered around the sea. But all three of us, four of us here, have been concerned about the fact that maritime history doesn't get its due, which is something you've explored.
Particularly, I do think there's an element of all of history that's now tied with the colonial brush and all the rest of it, that because of the neglect of indigenous history, there's been a counter-revolution to focus on that, which obviously is 100% the right way to go, but it shouldn't be at the exclusion of the rest of history.
Sure.
Because those times were seminal times in the founding of the nation, whether you agree with it, you don't agree with it, whatever your politics, whatever, it happened. and there were remarkable tales and stories, good and bad, particularly in the sea. They're not told.
But what's interesting to me about something like the Peltier story is that you've got essentially a maritime story that is not just a maritime story, it's actually about how Europeans and indigenous people relate to each other. That's what's so fascinating.
The first of the stolen children. Can I move to Nigel and ask you? Nigel is one of the other things I forgot to mention in his story of the sea is also a considerable sailor and deep sea sailor as well. So how did you get hooked by the sea, Nigel?
Yes, well, I guess there might be a genetic footprint there, in as much as my grandfather was a ship's engineer, Scottish, again, exiled who left Glasgow. He was dead long before I was born, so I never knew him, but I get a feeling I would have liked him. I would have liked to have met him. But my real introduction to the sea came after finishing a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in history in Tasmania, being sick of being very cold, and somebody offered the prospect of sailing on a boat to Brazil, which I thought was a rather good idea.
There it is.
10 years later, I was still sailing on the boat. The only difference was I now owned it. And it's part of a love story, I suppose. I mean, I sailed with my wife around the world.
Who incidentally told me once that you're a very good person to have beside you in a storm.
Well, that's possibly true. I'm not sure. I'm glad she feels reassured. I must be good at bluffing or something. But anyway, so it's this experience, and through 10 years, sailing across all oceans, working our way through storms, being in lovely anchorages, diving. I mean, we never had any money, so it was always a matter of maintaining the vessel. And I think my career was shaped by that experience. And gradually, my degree in history started to make more sense. And it's only in my later career, if you like, that I somehow saw the logic of marrying the maritime with the history. And that's how it all sort of has progressed.
You did have a period, an early period in your career when you were working with the Bounty or with Pitcairn. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, again, it goes back to being broke. I was always concerned when we were sailing back across the Pacific how we were going to get through the Tuamotu, the low and dangerous isles as they're marked on the map. So this is a string of pearl-like islets quite often they're very low lying. The highest thing is a palm tree, and there are very strong currents which rip through these. So if you were trying to get from Panama to Tahiti, you either have to go through these or you have to go under them, go south of them. And so we chose to go south because we didn't have a satellite navigator or any of that kind of thing. And in doing that, we ended up at Pitcairn Island. And you will know, I hope, that Pitcairn is the home of the Bounty mutineers. And when I was there, I ran into this lady, Charlotte Christian. And I was rather amazed that Charlotte seemed to be offering me archaeological things. You can see here she's got a sort of a pestle type arrangement, but she also had material, copper alloy objects, stone axes, anything you like was sort of for sale. And what that made me realise was that there was material for the Bounty which had never been documented, was basically being lost through this sort of trade. And I just sort of squirreled that away in my brain as something that I might like to come back and look at a later point. So,
which you did.
Indeed, and a PhD later, I did my PhD on Pitcairn finally. I took a group of archaeologists back there, archaeologists, conservators, and this is one of the reasons it's such a magical island. I mean, it's a very small rock, population about 50 people, but just a totally extraordinary environment. You can see here Bounty Bay looking down from the peak, looking into the water, and the remains of the Bounty lie about here. And while this is a very calm day, the reality is on most days you're diving in this kind of stuff. So a great deal of swell and quite often hard to see what you're doing, and not the kind of place you can do a nice settled archaeological dig, setting out tapes and that kind of thing. It's always a real challenge. So I was there for 4 months, and at the end of that period, working with the Pitcairn men, we brought up the last of the Bounty cannon, and you can't see it very clearly, but it's there in the bottom of the picture there, which we had an arrangement with the Queensland Museum and with the British government that we would have it conserved in Australia, and then ultimately after conservation we gave it back to Pitcairn, and I'm very happy to say that it's now, takes pride of place in their little museum on the island.
Yeah, well, stories. I thought we might talk a bit about stories. John, there's a story about the sea that has engaged our mutual interests, and that's the story of the Pandora, which connects also with the Bounty. Would you like to tell us a bit about the Pandora?
I would love to. It's a shared passion. Well, I think everybody from school years on knows the story of the mutiny on the Bounty. The story of the Pandora is every bit as extraordinary, really, and probably in many ways more extraordinary. The Pandora was the ship that the British sent to try to arrest the mutineers under the command of a guy called Captain Edward Edwards, who was a really tough SOB, and he'd been particularly chosen for his track record in putting down mutinies on a boat in the Moor, I think, where he hanged a whole lot of people from the yard arms and did one thing or another. Anyway, it's a very long story, and we don't have time to go into all of it, but he sailed off, got to Tahiti, arrested those mutineers who were still there, who had fallen in love with all the bare-breasted maidens and the life there, so clapped them all in irons in a box on the deck of the ship, including 3 or 4 people who actually were not guilty of mutiny at all, but they just happened to either not fit in the longboat or the mutineers needed their skills. So he said, I don't give a shit, you're going as well. So they threw them all in the box. Went off looking for Fletcher Christian, of course was not successful. He'd by that stage gone on to Pitcairn Island. He sailed around for a month or 2 looking for him, and eventually headed back to England. Got as far as the Northern Barrier Reef, trying to get through the Torres Strait. And they hit the reef there, got wrecked, ended up in the longboats and almost recreated Bly's journey to get rescued. Finally ended up, after a long, torturous story, back in the UK. And, some of the mutineers were hanged, some were pardoned, some etc. But that unbelievable story of hardship. And then there was even the Bounty's little boat that sailed with them got lost fairly early on. That also made it back. And another unbelievable tale of human endurance. I think the story is every bit as compelling and exciting as the Bounty story. It hasn't been popularised by Hollywood, but it's got all the makings of it for a talented filmmaker.
Exactly.
And you know, the other thing I think that's significant about it, I'm holding the limelight here, but that wreck lies in Northern Barrier Reef waters. It's in, as we understand it, and some of my colleagues here know much more about it than I do, but it's in a remarkable state of preservation. We've had a shared vision for quite some time, and we're now actually trying to do something about it. But why can't we at least map out the logistics of raising that and building a Mary Rose type, or Vassar? Everybody's seen the Vassar in Stockholm, or the Mary Rose in England. Australia doesn't have anything like that, and this is a piece of our very early heritage that it's a question of a lot of money and a lot of folks and a lot of time and a lot of effort to do it. But it could be raised theoretically, and we could build a purpose-built museum for it, and we could create an absolute iconic piece of our history. We're sort of playing with that. I've actually hired somebody who's working on that project full-time at the moment. You're about to get pestered on it. So we should at least give it a go. And that's what we're going to try and do.
Well, I'd like to segue to Mike now, because you are a specialist in stories and turning stories into film. And I guess one of the things I wanted to ask about is there anything special about the way that dealing with the sea stories work as a filmmaker? I mean, we made 3 stories. I don't know what the underlying challenges were for you, though I did see some going to a paradise island where it pissed with rain every single moment that we were there was a challenge for us. Can you talk something about your experience filming sea stories?
Well, there weren't, other than having no fuel at all to actually get to an island on one day, there weren't any intrinsic logistical difficulties. One thing I would say, though, about trying to do, it's very, very difficult to film at sea, and it's very, very difficult to make, I mean, what John and Nigel get excited about is what's lying on the seabed, and they understand its value, they understand its drama. It's very, very difficult to visualize that drama sometimes. The way into any story, and it's something I appreciated when we were doing those stories on the Barrier Reef, is trying to tell the story of the sea through character, always. So even when you're dealing with someone like Edmund Banfield, who is essentially a man who goes to live on an island paradise for 40 years, you're basically telling the story of people's relationship to the Great Barrier Reef and to that strip of sea, but through human endeavour, through human desire. So it's about always finding the human angle, always. There aren't necessarily intrinsic logistical difficulties, but always finding the human angle, the human story.
Yes, I was wondering about that with regard to your museum, John. I mean, to what extent, when you're hunting as a collector, to what extent are you driven by the object? To what extent by the story behind the object? I mean, or perhaps they're inseparable.
They are inseparable, but I think it's very much the story behind it. The interesting thing about most things that you collect is they were ephemera of the day, that in many cases are the equivalent of a Woolies receipt or something today that you just chuck in the bin and think, well, who would ever be interested in that? 300 years later, when it's actually got a signature of some significant person from history, of course it becomes priceless. The actual item itself is just a piece of paper with some writing on it, but the story it tells, or the emotion that it evokes in you, is what makes it compelling and exciting. To Mike's point, the trouble with the shipwrecks that we go and look for is exactly that. They're old wooden ships. They've been smashed into a reef. The coral's grown over them. You can be diving or standing on top of it and not realise the public image of a shipwreck is the Titanic with the chandelier swaying in the gloom and a box marked treasure, which is half open, and all that sort of thing. The reality of historical interest, it's massively exciting for those on the seabed doing it, but for everybody else it's a huge yawn.
I suppose there's greater excitement because of the degree of difficulty in it. I mean, because the coral, it's not, you're not going to suddenly come across a great wreck looming in the sea. There are fragments. But, I mean, you two discovered the King's boat, the Mermaid. What did you find? What did you see?
This is Philip Parker King, who between 1817 and 1821 circumnavigated Australia about 4 times, and 3 of those were in this rather small 80-odd foot cutter called the Mermaid, which we discovered in 2009 just south of Cairns. And the way we discovered that was looking at the historical narrative about its loss, but then using a magnetometer which picks up the signature of any large lumps of iron in the water. And you know, we found a number of these targets, and eventually we found the Mermaid. And what told us it was the Mermaid was, well, there were a string of objects, which obviously from a small sailing vessel, but ultimately we found a pulley sheave, that's the wheel inside a you know, block and tackle that takes the rope, with a broad arrow mark on it, the government mark of ownership, and also a bolt with the same broad arrow mark on it. So it's a very shallow site. I mean, at low tide, if you're lucky, you can't find your buddy, you can stand up and look for them. It's hardly sort of scuba diving at all. But it's a sort of a spread out wreck, and you find bits and pieces. And through using metal detectors, we were able to scan the seabed and to find that there was a concentration of these iron in one place, which is basically the ballast of the vessel. So we know that where the centre line of the vessel is, and we suspect that under that iron ballast there still remains of the teak hull and probably copper sheathing on the hull and all of those kind of things. But often, you know, as John says, these kind of wrecks in the Great Barrier Reef, they've been smashed to pieces, and so it's really a detective job, which my colleague Kieran up here is particularly good at. You know, you find bits and pieces, and you've then got to come back, do the research as to how all these bits and pieces fit into the story, and you know, tease out that story. For me, I often find the environment as well is like, well, when we've dived on Endeavour Reef, and you've talked about the following incident, etc. What was fascinating for me was to go to that site and to realise how clearly you could see the mountain range on the coastline there, and you know, I was seeing something which Cook must have pretty much seen. I mean, you can't see any houses there, there are no chimney stacks, anything like this. It's all the same, you know, silhouette, and it's still the same sort of green forested area. And to me, that sort of, you know, somehow sets the adrenaline going, and you're almost there with Cook and experiencing all that again. It makes sense when people read the account of the vessel being stuck there, and the fear and the wonder of whether or not they're going to get off. You know, it all suddenly focuses that episode.
And you remember when we were at Wreck Reef, where there's a big sand cay there, where Flinders' ships, the Porpoise and the Cato, were wrecked. And there's a sand cay, and 100 men spent a few months camped on this sand cay. And we went one night, several of us, and we just slept on the sand cay, just as they must have done lying there. You were 300 or 400 kilometres from the coast of Australia. And okay, in the background we had boats with sat phones on and all those sort of things, but nonetheless just the surf breaking and under the stars. You think these were young people from England, half of them couldn't swim. Sydney was a long way away. Yeah. That is so evocative. It's so exciting to be part of that.
It is, and I remember when we were filming the Cook film.
Yes.
You said something about Cook is that he didn't know the Barrier Reef was there.
Yes.
He had no idea. And there's kind of, it's almost a perception of Cook that he goes there with the charts already in his mind, and he knows how to navigate through this thing. But once I heard that, then I understood what the drama of the moment was. That as brilliant a navigator as he was, he had no idea where he was, and the dangers that kind of...
No, which is one of the reasons. I mean, people accuse him of being reckless because he was travelling at night, but he had no idea that there was coral around. And I mean, they'd seen a tiny coral cay just before at, you know, what's now Yarrabah, where Green Island is. But they'd not seen any coral reefs. They'd seen some shoals and shallows and rocks and so on. He travelled for 800 kilometres in the reef and didn't know he was in there. And once you realise that he only knows, they only actually recognise that there is something like a labyrinth after the wreck and subsequent. You know, so in fact, after when they're on the shore, standing on the island there, grassy knoll, looking out and seeing all these reefs.
And people still run onto the reef today with all of that technology, reverse, GPSs, the whole lot, every year. Yes. Big ships down to little boats do the same thing. And with all the charts and the whole caboodle. He's a remarkable mariner.
Yes. We also had an unusual experience at Cooktown because we spent quite a lot of time with an Indigenous woman called Alberta, her Gibson, but now Hornsby, who has done a great deal of work both trying to interrogate the possible Indigenous meanings of what happened with various people at Hopevale and elsewhere, but has also done work on the existing knowledge of Cook. Can you tell us a little bit about the impact of her?
It kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, is that through maritime history, you can understand a lot more about a country than simply, another tale of the sea or even a tale of navigation. There are bigger kind of themes within a maritime story, and Alberta was one of those bigger themes. That, here was a woman who was essentially using Cook's journals as a form of kind of one native title claim, but also as a way of trying to forge some reconciliation. That within the story of Cook's adventures at Cooktown, there was a tale there for contemporary Indigenous people about how you might reconcile, which I thought was absolutely fascinating.
There was a strong sense too in Lockhart River that we'd taken the story that you told, the Peltier story, to Lockhart River, and say something about its impact on...
Well, it was much the same there, where the maritime story had been used by the Indigenous people to reclaim their past, really, because these were people who, in the 1920s, had been, in some cases forced, but in others had voluntarily gone to the mission, which is just south of where Lockhart River is now. And they'd essentially lost their language and lost their culture. But the Peltier story, because it's such a detailed ethnographic account of life prior to European arrival, they'd actually been able to reclaim some of their past. So, in Cook's journals, in the story of Peltier, they've got a living link to the past, and it helps them to reclaim, their lives, really. It was very interesting.
It was this sense, and I guess it comes back to this problem of as archaeologist, as collector, as filmmaker, how do we get across the vigour of the maritime history of Australia? I mean, this incredible maritime nation, where there is a sense in which the maritime history, certainly in the profession of history, struggles. It's a marginal. It's seen largely as something that retired admirals, go in for. The movement of ships, how many, what you carried in that sort of thing in those days, that kind of thing. And so it's under practiced, under recognised. All of us have experienced that. So how do we change that? We're suggesting maybe the Pandora could.
Yeah, sadly, to get a wide audience, you have to popularise these things. I think, for tragics like myself, and maybe include you and some others, you know, the buzz comes out of our world, and it will be absorbing to the day I die. But I realise that it doesn't excite a lot of people, and I'm sure the challenge you have here with the Maritime Museum, people come in and, you know, they go halfway through it and then they're busy, they want to go and have a coffee, and, you know, and yet there's all this wonderful depth of material here to be experienced. I like old things. I understand we live in a digital world, and the digital world brings tremendous advantage of what you can research and understand and document and database and all the rest of it. But there is no substitute for actually opening a document that was signed with a shaking hand and a cool pen and candlelight back in the 1600s or the 1700s, smelling that document, and just that brings the whole thing alive to me, much more than a digital representation. But somehow you have to reach out to an audience where, you know, they don't share all of that passion. So you've got to capture them quick, and then hold that interest. I mean, it's more your world than mine.
Well, sure. Sorry, can I just ask one question? Why do you think it is that maritime history is, as a professional historian, why do you think maritime history is marginalised?
Well, I think it hasn't been seen as a social history for a couple of reasons. One is that we've always, many people have treated the sea as something that is undifferentiated. It's vast and it's implacable and it's enormous. It's unreadable, and it's a sort of specialised place that specialised people travel in. That's one thing. So people think they see it. What they know of the sea is what you see. So the specialities of sailing, Jonathan and I discovered, sailing a square rig, are very incredibly complex, as it was almost an industrial machine at that time. But the stuff's too difficult to understand, and too difficult to make a story that reaches out to all people. Someone was saying today, I think it was Margaret was saying, you know, this is boys' stuff. It's what my kids call ship shit, you know, the stories of the sea. And as far as they're concerned, ship shit is all boys' stuff. So there's a gender aspect to this. And it's because we haven't treated it as social and cultural history. That is, we haven't done the wider aspects that go into, it's tended to be worked on by specialists, either archaeologists or ex-naval people or people who've sailed in steamers and so on. So what we need to do really is to colonise it as cultural historians, because it's so rich. It's a rich way of getting at all sorts of aspects of society. And I think that's, I don't know what you think about that, Nigel.
Well, I think you mentioned previously, earlier this year I had an exhibition which was called East of India, which was about Australia's dependence on India in that colonial period. But in going to England, I met somebody who had a project called the East India Company at Home. And when you talk about bringing that story and opening up the sea story, what they were doing was looking at artefacts, objects which have been brought back from the East by some of these grandees of the East India Company who'd established, you know, great mansions in the countryside and things. Many of these homes were now staffed by volunteers, and they were open for tours and things like that. So they actually got the volunteers to do the research on some of those objects. And, you know, they got these fascinating stories from all over the country, not only of the person who had, you know, initially established the house through some sort of fortune, but then, you know, the generations after that, how the house had been maintained, and what, you know, residual objects remained from that initial story. So, you know, it was fascinating because it sort of tied in the story of the East, the story of Britain, the story of the waterways between the ships and those who actually, you know, managed to make a lot of money out of the whole process. So, yeah, I found that fascinating, and you know, it brought people who are not experts into the sphere as well, and empowered them to do their research, and their research was held up in high esteem. So
sure,
that was a great project.
Perhaps at this point we might throw it open to questions. museum. He has a number of boats that ply a trade for him in the Solomons, and he is a philanthropist, particularly in the Pacific, with a foundation called Silent World, and there are other things, but we'll get on to those. Mike Blewett is a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and has made films of all kinds, but many, many films, documentary films associated with the sea, and particularly more recently for me, we've worked together to make 3 documentary films on the Great Barrier Reef, and it was a fantastic experience. So, you know, I've had to capture Mike and drag him to try to talk about 3 people who I think are people of the sea, who have sea experiences that are inimitable in a variety of ways. And since we're going to be unpacking their lives, I'm not going to do big intros. I'll simply say that, simply give you a one-word description of why they have, or how, at least to my knowledge, they have a connection with the sea. John is pretty difficult because he has about 7 connections with the sea. He is a very enthusiastic and capable diver and amateur archaeologist. He is a museum person with his own down from Cairns, because he's a reef man, and to get him to talk about that. And then at the end we've got Nigel Erskine, who is a curator of the sea. He's done a great exhibition this year on the India-New South Wales trade, or India-Australia, early India-Australia trade, but many other exhibitions. He's a museum director and curator with all sorts of sea experience and island experience, but he's also an archaeologist, maritime and marine archaeologist. So we have a kind of variations of the sea pictures, of sea mood pictures of different kinds. So I'm going to start with, and I hope that they will have a conversation between them. If you want to ask questions while we're talking, put up your hand and we'll integrate them into the discussion, because it's going to be very informal, and you know, we're not going to kind of stand on ceremony at all. So John, I'm going to ask each of you in turn. This first simple question is your earliest engagement with the sea. I mean, how did you, in your early life, if it come to be connected with the sea, which I presume you must have done? I'll ask the same of Mike, and I'll ask the same of Nigel. But can we begin with you, John?
Yes, certainly can.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last session of the afternoon. It's going to be informal, and I hope that we will all be able to participate as much as possible. But we're going to have our participation triggered by in a sort of quasi-Parkinson, pseudo-Parkinson attempt on my part. I'd forgotten his name until about a minute ago.